story time. But I couldn't do it without him because I feel like it's wrong to only put out one side. So, here we go.
Okay, so the story is that we are getting divorced because it was our decision. It's my best friend. I still love her to death. Like, we still got a child together. We still gonna be hanging out. I'm probably
All
gonna
the
see
time.
her most days of the week, but at the end of the day, we got shit to do. That's it. You feel me? She has a path to go. I got a path to go, but our paths are parallel, and we always gonna be next to each other.
Yeah.
And who's to say what's gonna happen in the future? All that we know is right now. Right now, it's the best. I mean, real talk, it's the best decision for both of us. For her to do what she needs to do, for me to do what I need to do. So
we can grow and heal and
that's it.
Elevate. No hard feelings. This is not a messy divorce or anything like that. We don't do that. This is like I said. Like he said, this is my best friend at the end of the day. He has been before the relationship, before the marriage, before the kid. So nothing's gonna change that. So
And like, look at her, bro. Like, I would never lose this forever. For real. And look.
So we're good, y'all. We're
For
good.
real though, like for real, for real.
Promise y'all.
That's it.
There is no perfect time. All you have is right now. All the time you have is right now. All the opportunities you have are right now. Tomorrow is not promised, so make the most of today. Live with no regrets. None. Don't die with your dreams inside of you.
She was 29 years old, full of life, a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of the Nashville home she shared with her husband. To those who knew her, April Holt was kind, bright, and hopeful. Someone who never hesitated to help the people she loved. But on a quiet July evening, everything changed. A frantic call to 911. Paramedics rushing through the front door. And there on the cold bathroom floor, April was found, unresponsive. A plastic bag sealed around her neck, duct tape binding it in place. She was still breathing when they got to her, but barely. At the hospital, doctors fought to save her. Hours passed, then days. But the damage had been done. Her body had endured too much, too fast. She never woke up. The official report came months later, a ruling from the medical examiner's office. Complications from suffocation. The cause of death, suicide. That should have been the end of it. A tragic, devastating end to a young woman's life. Another statistic in the growing crisis of self-harm. But one person refused to accept it. Her mother, Jamie Dickerson, knew her daughter. She knew what April had been through, what she had struggled with. And she also knew what she would never do. Something wasn't right. The pieces didn't fit. April had no history of suicidal behavior, no signs of distress in the days leading up to her death. No note, no explanation. And then there was the tape. It was the first thing that sent a chill down Jamie's spine. The plastic bag that suffocated April hadn't simply been wrapped around her neck. It had been taped, secured, almost as if it was never meant to come off. The authorities stood by their ruling. The case was closed. But Jamie, she wasn't done asking questions. She started searching for answers herself, piecing together every last detail, refusing to let her daughter's story end in silence. And when she looked closer, when she demanded the truth, she uncovered something that changed everything. Because there, on the very tape that sealed April's fate, was something that should never have been there. Something that shattered the entire investigation. Something that would lead police back to the one person they never suspected. And once the truth came out, there would be no turning back. April Holt was 29 years old, a woman with a warm smile, an infectious laugh, and a heart that never hesitated to put others first. She had dreams, ones she spoke about often, a future she was building, step by step. She had always been the kind of person who saw the good in people, even when others couldn't. Friends say she had a way of making those around her feel valued, loved. To her family, she wasn't just April. She wasn't just April, their sister, their best friend, someone they thought they would have a lifetime with. And for a time, it seemed like she had found the person she was meant to share that lifetime with. Donovan Holt entered April's life as many relationships do, full of hope, excitement, and promise. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who knew how to say the right things at the right moments. From the outside, they looked like any other couple, smiling in photos, holding hands, celebrating milestones together. But pictures don't tell the whole story. What seemed like love wasn't always what it appeared to be. And those closest to April would later admit they had seen things, subtle things, a shift in the way she carried herself, a hesitation in her voice, moments of unease that were brushed aside with nervous laughter or a quiet reassurance. Everything's fine. At first, the concerns were easy to dismiss. Every couple has disagreements. Every relationship has its difficult moments. But looking back, some of those moments weren't just difficult. There were times April seemed more distant, withdrawing from those who knew her best. Times when she cancelled plans last minute, when she seemed more tired, more careful with her words. And then there were the things she didn't say. The pauses when someone asked how she was doing. The way she changed the subject when Donovan's name came up. The way her bright, confident spirit seemed quieter. No one could have known in those early days how this story would end. But some would later wonder if they had missed the signs. If the warnings had been there all along. If they had only known how much time they had left to save her. It was a quiet night in Nashville. The kind of night where the world outside felt still, where the hum of streetlights and the distant sound of cars on the freeway were the only reminders that life was still moving. Inside the Holt residence, behind closed doors, something was happening, something no one would hear. At exactly 9:47 p.m., a 911 call was placed. The voice on the other end was rushed, frantic. A man, barely holding it together. He told the dispatcher his wife wasn't breathing, that he had found her in the bathroom, that she wasn't responding. Minutes later, sirens cut through the stillness of the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flickered against the walls of the house as paramedics rushed inside. And there, on the bathroom floor, they found her. April Holt, unconscious, unmoving. A plastic bag sealed tightly around her neck. Duct tape wrapped over the plastic, securing it in place. She had a pulse, but it was faint. Every second mattered. They lifted her onto the stretcher, moving fast, their voices clipped and urgent as they worked to stabilize her. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and shallow breaths. And then, just like that, she was in their hands. Doctors fought to save her. Machines beeped. Medications were pushed. But the damage had already been done. Hours turned into days. And then, on a quiet hospital bed, surrounded by the steady hum of life support machines, April Holt took her final breath. She was gone. It wasn't long before the official ruling came. The medical examiner's office determined that her death was the result of complications from suffocation. Suicide. A case closed before it ever truly opened. But something wasn't right. Her family, her mother, didn't believe it. And when they started looking closer, the story they had been told didn't quite match the story the evidence was beginning to reveal. Because if April had done this to herself, then why was someone else's fingerprint on the tape? The official ruling was clear. April Holt had taken her own life. That was the story written in the reports, signed off by authorities, sealed as fact. But one person refused to believe it. Jamie Dickerson had known her daughter for 29 years. She knew the way April spoke when she was happy, the way she sounded when she was upset, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the future she was building. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty: April would not have done this. At first, people told her to grieve, to find peace in the answers she had been given. But Jamie couldn't, because the answers didn't make sense. April had no history of self-harm, no warning signs, no note. And then there was the way she was found. A plastic bag secured so tightly around her neck that paramedics had to cut through layers of tape just to reach her skin. Tape that had been wrapped with force. Tape that wasn't loosely placed, but bound, deliberate control. Something about it was wrong. Jamie didn't just feel it, she knew it. And when she started looking closer, she saw things that others had missed. She studied the case, she read the reports, she examined every piece of evidence that had been so easily categorized as a suicide. And then she found it. The tape. The very thing that sealed her daughter's fate. Jamie pushed for it to be re-examined. She demanded answers. She refused to accept silence. And when forensic testing was done, when the results came back, when investigators looked at the evidence with fresh eyes, everything changed. Because the fingerprints on the tape didn't belong to April. They belonged to Donovan Holt, the husband who had stood beside her, the man who had made the 911 call, the person who had told the world that his wife had taken her own life. He had left his mark on the very thing that suffocated her. And once that truth came to light, there was no turning back. For months, the case remained unchanged. The reports had been filed, the ruling had been issued, the world had moved on. But not Jamie Dickerson. While others accepted the official explanation, she couldn't. The version of events laid out in the reports didn't align with the daughter she knew. The investigation felt incomplete, rushed. And then there was the evidence, the details that had been overlooked, dismissed as unimportant. The fingerprints, the tape, the inconsistencies. Every time Jamie read the reports, every time she looked at the autopsy findings, the same thought echoed in her mind. They got it wrong. She started asking questions, pushing for answers, not just with quiet concern, but with persistence that made it impossible to ignore. She called detectives, reached out to forensic experts. She spoke to anyone who would listen. And then, finally, someone did. The Metro Nashville Police Department Cold Case Unit took another look. They reopened the case. They re-examined the evidence. And what they found shattered the original narrative. April had been found with a plastic bag over her head, duct tape wrapped tightly around her neck. It had been ruled a suicide. But now something wasn't adding up. The positioning of the tape, the way it had been secured, the fact that April had no history of self-harm. And then the discovery that changed everything. Fingerprints. Not just any fingerprints. Donovan Holt's. The man who had made the frantic 911 call. The man who had stood in front of paramedics, watching as they tried to save his wife. The man who had insisted, without hesitation, that April had done this to herself. His fingerprints were on the tape that sealed the bag shut. Suddenly, the carefully crafted story started to unravel. Authorities now had evidence that directly contradicted the initial ruling. What was once considered an open and shut case had transformed into something far more disturbing. And there was only one person who could explain what really happened. Donovan Holt. Investigators tracked him down to San Antonio, Texas. It had been a year since April's death, a year since he had stood over her lifeless body, making that 911 call. This time, the questions were different. The pressure was heavier. The walls were closing in. For the first time, Donovan was forced to confront the truth. And this time, there was no way out. He broke. The man who had spent an entire year living freely, carrying the weight of a deadly secret, finally confessed. No more denials, no more explanations. He admitted it. He was responsible. He had been the one to strangle April Holt. The woman who had once trusted him, who had shared a life with him, had died by his hands. But even as investigators recorded his confession, there was one lingering question. Why? What led to that night? What happened behind closed doors in those final moments? Had this been a moment of uncontrollable rage? Or had it been something more deliberate, something premeditated? Whatever the case, Donovan Holt had finally spoken the truth. And the weight of that truth was enough to change everything. Shortly after his confession, he was taken into custody, charged with reckless homicide, evidence tampering, and false reporting. But for Jamie Dickerson, for the family who had fought to bring this case back into the light, the fight wasn't over. Because now a new battle had begun. Would the justice system truly hold Donovan Holt accountable? Or was this just the beginning of another fight for the truth? For an entire year, Donovan Holt walked free. He went on with his life. He worked, he ate, he slept, while the woman who once trusted him, the woman who had once stood by his side, was gone. But now, there was no more escaping what had been done. On a quiet day in July, in San Antonio, Texas, law enforcement closed in. Detectives from the Metro Nashville Police Department, alongside local authorities, moved in on their target. And when the knock came at Donovan Holt's door, there was no warning, no time to run. This time, the questions weren't gentle. This time, there was no way out. He was taken into custody. The man who had sat through an entire year of investigations, offering nothing but lies, was now in handcuffs. His charges: reckless homicide, evidence tampering, false reporting. But for April's family, for her mother, Jamie Dickerson, this wasn't the moment of relief they had been waiting for. Because these charges weren't enough. April Holt wasn't a name on a case file. She wasn't just another statistic. She was a daughter, a friend, a person with a future. Reckless homicide, that wasn't justice. Her family wanted the world to know April didn't die because of a reckless mistake. She was killed. And so, the fight continued. A petition began circulating, urging prosecutors to increase the charges from reckless homicide to second-degree murder. Thousands of signatures poured in. People who had never met April, who had only heard her story, stood alongside her family. They demanded more. They demanded a sentence that reflected the truth. And as Donovan Holt sat behind bars, waiting for his trial, he knew this wasn't going away. The courtroom would become the battleground. Attorneys would argue, evidence would be laid bare, witnesses would testify. And in the end, a jury would decide whether Donovan Holt's crime had been an accident, or something much worse. Because now the world was watching. When April Holt died, her case was nearly closed before it ever began. But then something happened. People started asking questions. It began with her mother, Jamie Dickerson, relentless, unwavering in her search for answers. But soon, she wasn't the only one demanding justice. April's story spread. True crime podcasters picked it up, dissecting every inconsistency, every detail the initial investigation had missed. Journalists began digging deeper, exposing gaps in the case. And then the public stepped in. A petition was created, demanding that the charges against Donovan Holt be raised from reckless homicide to second-degree murder. At first, it was just a few signatures. Then, 100. People who had never met April, who had never even heard her name before, were now standing in solidarity because they saw something familiar in her story. A woman dismissed, a tragedy explained away too easily, a case that could have been buried if not for a mother's persistence. Candlelight vigils were held, social media lit up with hashtags calling for justice. And for the first time since that night in July, April Holt's name wasn't just a headline. It was a movement. But would it be enough? Because for every voice demanding change, there were those who questioned it. Some argued that Donovan Holt's charges were already severe, that reckless homicide was the appropriate ruling. But others saw it differently. They saw a confession that came only when he had no other choice. They saw a man who had tried to cover his tracks. And they saw a justice system that too often let cases like April's fade into silence. The fight wasn't over. Because while Donovan Holt sat in jail awaiting trial, there was one question still left unanswered. Would the system see April Holt as just another case? Or would it finally see her for who she truly was? A woman who deserved justice. April Holt was failed once when her death was ruled a suicide. She was failed again when the truth nearly slipped through the cracks. If her mother hadn't fought back, if no one had asked the hard questions. How many others have been silenced the same way? How many stories like April's never get a second look? The justice system doesn't always get it right the first time, and sometimes it takes more than an arrest to bring true justice. Donovan Holt confessed. But is that enough? Should his charges be raised? Should he face second-degree murder instead of reckless homicide? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe stories like April's need to be told, if you believe the truth should never be buried, subscribe, because this is just one case. And there are so many more waiting to be uncovered.